Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining today's Madison Network Alumni webinar. My name is Emma Maynard, and I'm the Assistant Director of Career and Network Programming here at James Madison University. I'm also a proud double Duke of JMU, having graduated in 2007 with my degree in sociology, and more recently with my master's in 2016. I'm really excited to bring today's Madison Network webinar to you. It's hosted by the JMU Alumni Association. Thank you all so much for participating, whether you're participating live or listening later on demand. Before I introduce today's speaker, just some notes. If you are participating live, your microphones are muted for our presentation today. However, you do have some chat options. So please note that you can open your chat feature using the icon at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And as you have questions of our presenter, you can use the Q&A feature and send your question privately, which will send it directly to me, the host. I'll be sure to share your questions at the end of Rachel's presentation for her to respond to. Feel free to also use your chat option during the presentation to engage in real time with your fellow Dukes by selecting all participants, typing your response or your thoughts or feedback, and selecting send. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and will be accessible on demand on our website under the Madison Network section. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Rachel is a partner, mom, daughter, and sister who writes in pursuit of connection with herself and with others. Sharing the journey of her son's diagnosis of congenital heart disease on a national stage was the inspiration behind Rachel's creative business, Orchid Story. The mission of Orchid Story is to empower individuals to tell their stories of struggle as a path to finding freedom and meaning. Rachel was an integrated science and technology major and competed on the gymnastics team during her time at JMU. She also received her MS in genetic counseling from the University of Pittsburgh in 2005. She's been a genetic counselor for the past 12 years in both academia and industry. She lives with her husband, Kurt, who's also an alum, and her 2 children in Vienna, Virginia. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Rachel to do her presentation, The Story of My Life.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction. And I want to say thank you to the Madison Network and the JMU Alumni Association for having me today. I'm really excited and very honored to be here. I love all things JMU, so it's so much fun to get an opportunity to talk with you all about a little bit about my story and hopefully try to convince you why it is relevant and important for you to consider your own story. So let's go ahead and get started. The key takeaways for today that I want you to walk away with are a couple of pieces of the science of storytelling. So what's behind all of this aside from just sharing our stories with each other? What's the science that backs it up? I want to, like I mentioned, convince you to consider starting to tell your story and what would that look like for you. And we'll also touch on story as branding. So whether you work for yourself, if you have your own company or you're an entrepreneur, or if you're working for another corporation, how can you use story in your own work? Okay, so of course I have to get started with my story about how Orchid Story came to be. And so as you see here on this image, the ultrasound image that you see, it kind of all started there. But actually, I want to go back even further to when I was a graduate student in genetic counseling, and I was sitting in a room with a pregnant couple by myself for the first time, and I was tasked with the opportunity to talk with this couple about an abnormality that had been seen on their sonogram that day in terms of the pregnancy that they were carrying. And I don't remember too much. I was, I guess, probably 23 years old, scared out of my mind about talking with this couple. I don't remember too much of the words I used that day, and I don't remember what they said, but I remember the feeling of being in that room and the emotions that filled that room, and the importance of what I did say, and that the impact of my words that day would carry forward with this couple. And so it was that idea that I had felt before in my life, but I think in that moment was really solidified that this was sort of a dividing line between the before and the after. When they walked out of that room, things would be forever changed for that couple. So fast forward about 5-6 years from that moment, my husband, Kurt, and I were that couple in that room with the sonographer looking at our baby. I was about 20 weeks pregnant going in for the fetal anatomy scan, which everybody knows is when you can find out the sex of the baby, and actually that's changed since then, but the technology at that moment in time was this was when we can find out the sex of the baby. And even though I had this experience in a lot of experience at this point in time in genetic counseling and knowing all the myriad of things that can go wrong in a pregnancy, I have to admit I wasn't too focused on that piece that day. So when the sonographer, our sonographer on that day, started taking a really long time with our sonogram and kept asking me to shift around, and it became pretty clear to me that something was going on with our baby's heart. And I had just enough knowledge of sonography to know where she was focusing. And the tactic that they often use is take a break, take a rest, I'll come back in a couple of minutes and we'll try again. She left the room and Kurt looked at me and I could just see in his eyes he was questioning what was going on, and I said to him, something is wrong. It was just very clear that something was up, and it seemed to be pretty significant. So that was our introduction to the world of pediatric cardiology. Even though I have a somewhat medical background, this was completely new for me. We had to learn really quickly. And pretty soon we were faced with a big decision about whether or not to undergo an experimental procedure that would potentially have the ability to help improve our son's heart condition. And it was a very difficult decision because it was new. There wasn't data to back it up. We couldn't look at the statistics. We couldn't do the research on this procedure. And it was also complicated by the fact that there was lots of different opinions about this procedure at that point in time. So we really kind of did our best as we could in talking with as many people as we could and went for it. And the procedure was technically successful, but we knew that in other families it had been technically successful, and that did not necessarily mean a healthy baby or healthy outcomes for the baby. So we were really living in this world of uncertainty for a long time. Our son is now 6, he's doing quite well, but in those first few years of his life, we were expecting surgery at any moment's notice, and it never came. So we really had to learn, how do we live in this uncertainty where we don't know what's going to happen next? We really have no idea, what is this life going to look like? How is this going to affect our lives? And so I was kind of walking around in that murky territory for a long time. When he was about 4, a colleague of mine reached out and said, Rachel, we're doing a presentation at our genetic counseling national meeting this year about fetal interventions, and I think you'd be a great candidate to be a speaker because you're a genetic counselor and you can talk about your own story. And I said, yes, that sounds like a great opportunity. And what I decided to do, instead of just getting up and kind of spitting it out like I'm doing with you all today, is I decided to interview my husband and each of our kids about their journey and about their experience with all of this. And I was kind of going for a StoryCorps, if you're familiar with that podcast kind of effect. I put it all together, I poured my heart into this, edited it, produced it with music, and I played that for this audience at this national meeting. And this process of going through, really digging into my story and talking with my family members about it in this different way was really impactful for me. It gave me a sense of being able to have control over this situation that nothing else we had done, seeing counselors, talking to other families, nothing else had affected me in this way that going through my story and really digging into it had done. And so after that meeting, fast forward again a couple of years when I had an opportunity to start my own business, I said, I want to share this with other people because at that point, I didn't know that there was a lot of science behind it, but I just felt that it had done so much for me that it was something I wanted to share with other people. And that is how my business orchid story was kind of born. Okay, so let's move on from there. I'm going to switch gears and talk about the science behind personal storytelling. And it really surrounds this whole concept of narrative identity. And so this concept is our ever-changing and evolving set of self-stories. It's the way that we process and interpret our difficult experiences to create a life story. So it's kind of this whole idea of reflecting back on the challenging experiences that we've had, and how does that integrate into who you are as a person, and just, how you present yourself to the world. And I love this quote by one of the researchers, Paul Rose. So he says, "We draw together disparate past events into a meaningful whole by establishing causal and meaningful connections between them." And there are some different components of narrative identity. This isn't exhaustive, what I'm talking with you all about today, but it's the concepts that have resonated the most with me, and that I can kind of look at my story, and not just this one, but other stories that I've experienced in my life too, and kind of pull out, oh yeah, that's how I talk about this particular concept. So let's go through these one by one. So the first is autobiographical reasoning. So this is the idea of making connections between events that have occurred in your past and yourself. So what I was saying before, how did that affect me? How did that impact who I am as a person? And an example that I've seen of this in the literature is a young person whose parents get divorced when they're a teenager. And so this young woman's self-story of this sort of treasured space that she holds in the family, the daughter of mom and dad, starts to feel very vulnerable and shaky. And through high school, she kind of goes back and forth between their homes, and she's forced to interact with new versions of her parents as they start kind of rebuilding their lives separately. So she heads to college, and eventually she moves to a new city to start her adult life. And over time, as she reflects back on this sort of tumultuous time in her own life, she recognizes that based on these past events and the meaning that they hold for her, her values have kind of shifted. So in high school, she thought of herself as being very selfless and dependable, and now she's switched gears, and the values that she holds most dear are self-respect and openness. So that's just an example for you. Okay, moving on to coherence. So this is the idea that the story is woven together by a common theme. And it doesn't have to be like a very explicit theme, though I'll give you an example. Later today we'll talk about, or later this hour we'll talk about the ugly duckling. So if we use that example, the common theme there is the search for identity, and that kind of is woven into the story. But it's really, how are the different scenes of the story threaded together, and how does one part of the story, one scene, lead into the next one? So it's kind of the binding of the story. And then finally, coherent positive resolution. So this is kind of when the story is complete, there's a sense of it being complete, and we're released in some capacity by the grip of the event. So remember when I was talking about my experience in telling my story in front of this audience and going through that process, that I hadn't really felt that release, we could call it, that sense of closure until I did that. And so this concept really strikes a chord with me. I really believe in this one. And it doesn't suggest that it's complete closure, that we like tie up our story in a bow, because obviously I'm still thinking about Griffin's heart every day. I'm wondering, and there's a sense of uncertainty that's not completely resolved. But it's just a sense of allowing the person to move on and to figure out the place for this story in their life. So you're not stuck. You don't feel paralysis about how to move on. Okay, so why is this important? Like, why do we want to do this? What's the impact of going through this idea of personal storytelling and using these concepts to help build our story? Well, the literature suggests that doing this process reminds us that we can overcome adversity, and it helps us to build resilience. And I know that we hear about resilience all the time, but let's just talk for a minute about what it is. So resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. That could be trauma, tragedy, anything where there's a significant stressor. So it could be with family, relationship problems, health problems, work stuff going on at work, or financial stress, anything that's causing a significant amount of stress. So it means the ability to recover from these setbacks and to keep going on, kind of this idea of bouncing back. And research about resilience has shown that it's not an extraordinary thing. All of us do have the capacity for resilience. It's just that we do have to work at it. And in order to work at it, we kind of have to dig through some emotional distress, because the difficult times in our life obviously they can make us feel angry or sad or some more negative emotions. And that's how we really build this resilience. And the research has shown that as we increase resilience, we increase satisfaction with our life. So it really is something, that I think is really important. I think a lot of people in this day and age feel that it's an important concept too. Okay, so like I just said, I was kind of mentioning these more negative emotions and these challenging times. So the research on personal storytelling has really shown that we do get more out of this process when we go back and we look at and examine those hard times, those challenging times. So I think that makes sense intuitively. But if we go back and look at all the really joyful times we have, we just won't get that same buildup of resilience that you get when you really examine those challenging times in your life. And there's even been a suggestion in the literature that a coherent narration of your life stories, doing this process that we're talking about here, may actually be a defense for depression. So it's really interesting and exciting research into this. And Jennifer Powell's, this quote is by her. She's a researcher that has published a lot on personal storytelling. And she says this quote that I really like. So she says, difficult experiences as challenges to identity and an inevitable aspect of adulthood constitute critical building blocks within the life story that not only reflect, but may also meaningfully shape how adults progress through their lives. Okay, so we just went through the science part of the presentation. Now is the time, the interactive piece, where I'm going to give you a chance, just a small chance, to start actually taking some steps towards starting to tell and write your own story. So we'll go through a couple of slides, and then I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to get started on some writing here. Okay, and these are sort of the starting points that I've gleaned from the literature. I have a course that I've developed on writing your story. And as I said before, when I was telling my story about my son, like, this happened over years. So it's not like in a 1 hour presentation we're going to get your story down. But you know, we have to start somewhere, and starting just by writing and getting some ideas out is a great place to start. So the first suggestion I have is to record your self-defining memories. Well, what's that? So the self-defining memories for each of us are those that are really emotional. They're vivid. So like you can picture in your mind exactly who was there when this happened, the location, maybe even the smells and the sounds. It's vivid. And they're critical to the person that you are today. So start thinking about what some self-defining memories could be for you. Okay, but if you're like, wait, that's too much, I'm not ready to go there yet. Another way that we can get started, and I have a whole bunch of little tricks and ideas to get people started, because if you're not used to writing, it can feel really daunting, and where do I start and how do I even get going? And it doesn't really matter, I think, is one of the bottom lines, as long as you start and just get going somewhere. But one of these suggestions that I like is, I actually adapted this from the Writing Class Radio podcast, a great podcast. But she suggests that you start by listing the worlds that you live in. So I know that seems a little maybe abstract, but for me, to give you an example, now you know a little bit about me. So some of my worlds that I live in are the world of a heart mom, a genetic counselor, or an interfaith family, and all of us, or at least probably most of us here, are JMU alumni. So start just by listing these worlds that you live in. Okay. So I want you to pick one of these two suggestions, and I'll give you about 30 seconds just to jot down some notes to start going on your personal story. So remember, the first one was to record your self-defining memories. You can just list them. And second, to make a list of the worlds that you live in. Okay. So I don't want to take too much of our precious time here and your precious time. So let's move on. But hopefully that gave you a little bit of juice to get started. Okay, so kind of step two, if we're thinking about these in terms of steps, would be to, now that you've thought about those self-defining memories, how did those events change you? And in what way did they change you? So remember, we talked before in our example of autobiographical reasoning about this young woman who rethought her values after a few years out from her parents' divorce, and how that changed what was important to her. So you can think about whether your values have changed, shifted. And this doesn't have to be dramatic, but remember how I said earlier that for a lot of situations that occur to us in our lives that are challenging, there is that kind of dividing line of the before and after. So who were you as a person in the before, and what did that look like in the after? And how did your view of the world change? Did it change? So let's again take a couple seconds to work on this, and then we'll go on to the next step. Okay. And then the third piece, which again, this takes a significant amount of time to really work through all of this, at least for me it does, is to start piecing it together. So remember, we talked about coherence, so thinking about the structure of your story and the storyline, and what is sort of that underlying theme that brings the different pieces of your story together. So my suggestion is to weave your memories and their meaning together in a way that feels unified and conveys the lessons learned. Okay, so let's shift from personal storytelling to brand storytelling. And again, I think this can have an effect on you even if you are a worker bee in a traditional corporation, to think about how you tell the story of your company. So traditional advertising tends to focus on those sort of biggest and best claims. And the shift to storytelling is really to engage people and to create a connection. And we'll talk a little bit about what are some ways that companies and brands do this. So the first thing to think about is, who is the story about? So there's really only a couple of options here. Is the story that you're going to tell about the corporation, the company? Is it about a specific product? Or is it about the consumer? And for the consumer, that would often be companies that offer a particular service. So you can tell a story about the customer that you're trying to serve. And there's some key components that have been published about brand storytelling that make an effective story. So one is the origin story, and that was kind of what I walked you through with Orchid's story at the top of the hour. 2, the mission, and 3, behind the scenes. So we'll go through and I'll give a couple examples of each of these different components and some companies that do this really well. So for origin story, I love the origin story of Spanx, and the owner of this company is Sarah Blakely. So her story is that she managed to land a meeting with a buyer at Neiman Marcus, and this was in Texas, I think. And she was wearing a pair of tight white pants, and she invited the buyer to go with her into the ladies' room. And she literally showed the buyer what the pants looked like with the Spanx underneath and then without the Spanx. And 3 weeks later, her product was on the shelves of Neiman Marcus. So I think that's a really cool origin story. In terms of mission, I think there's a lot of great mission-focused companies, but Tom's is one that sticks out and a lot of people recognize, and I think it's just been part of their brand from the beginning. So the mission is what motivates you and your team to come to work every day. And for Tom's, it's this idea of 1 for 1. So for every shoes you purchase from Tom's Sunglasses, they may have even expanded further than that. Tom's gives a pair to a child in need. So that is their mission that they focus on, that everything, all of their branding focuses on that mission. And then in terms of behind the scenes, there's a lot of examples of behind the scenes. I struggle here to figure out which one to share. A lot of smaller companies are doing behind the scenes on like Instagram stories, and it's just so much fun to see the work that goes on behind the published picture and image or video. And one company that does this is actually Walt Disney. They have a whole section of their blog that's dedicated to behind the scenes videos. It's a really fun way to see, like one of them is on their cruise ship, their shows and all the behind the scenes and the planning of the shows. It's just a really great way to draw people in. Okay, so I'm going to finish up my presentation today with a couple of slides from Andrew, or some ideas from Andrew Stanton, who's from Pixar, and he has a lot of stuff out there. He has a great TED Talk, and I kind of picked out what I felt were some really interesting tidbits to his clues for a great story. So they're listed here, and this is where I'm going to kind of walk you through the ugly duckling as the example. So first he says, make me care. So this is drawing in the sympathy of the audience. And with the ugly duckling, he's rejected by his siblings. So we feel bad for him. We want to see what happens. Secondly, take me with you. So at the heart of the story is a journey or some kind of mystery or a problem. With my story, as we heard, our problem was what to do or not do about our son's heart and when he was in utero. With the ugly duckling, his journey is a venture out into the world all by himself. Number 3 is be intentional. So the main character needs to have some inner motivation that's kind of pushing her along. And so, as I mentioned before, the ugly duckling is in search of his identity, and he really wants to be accepted. Number 4 is let me like you. So there is something to be said about the villains, but with the protagonist, we need to relate to that character. There has to be something that we empathize with. Otherwise, why are we paying attention? And with the ugly duckling, he experiences a lot of ups and downs, just like all of us do in life. And so we can really relate to that. And number 5 is delight me. So this is kind of charming the audience, making them forget where they are, even if it's just for a moment. And you can think about in a movie theater, how you kind of go in and leave 2 hours later and been transfixed during that time. So that's a sign of a good story. And in the ugly duckling, this moment comes when he transforms into a beautiful swan. And this quote I feel like this quote is critical to my business, Orchid Story. It just holds so much meaning. It's from Andrew Stanton, and he says, frankly, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story. And that's sort of what I believe about all of us. And I think if we take the time to listen to each other's stories and also tell our own, there's just so much to be learned from each other. I went through these quickly, but these are my references. I'm not going to stay on this slide, but if anyone is interested in getting a copy of my references, you can email me and I'll be glad to send them to you. And then finally, I'll just finish up by saying I would love to hear from you and engage with you. The best way to find me is at orchidstory.com, my website. If you sign up for my newsletter, I have a download that really outlines what we talked about today in the presentation. So I'd be happy to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you. And I think that's it, Emma.
Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your story and for providing all of us such really good information on how we can start to narrate our stories and our big moments in our lives. I did have just some questions just to get to hear a little bit more about how you got to where you are. So to start out with, you know, you were in genetic counseling for 12 years, and now with Orchid Story, you know, taking that leap and developing this entrepreneurial path takes a lot of work and a lot of guts. Could you talk a little bit about just, you know, those first few days or weeks or even months of developing Orchid Story as a business and what that looked like for you?
Sure. Oh, I probably could talk for a while on this. So I will say that the seeds were planted, you know, before I actually decided to launch the business. And I still work as a genetic counselor. And that is very much a part of my life that I want to continue. So I work 50% time right now as a genetic counselor, and the other 50% of my time I dedicate to Orchid Story. I think one of the scariest things is going from a very defined income and benefits to what in the world is this going to look like. And I just am not the kind of person that would be able to do that right now to get started. So it was a really nice little safety net to continue to work part-time. And I think I mentioned that I had an opportunity for a new job that I knew was really enticing to me that was only a 0.5 FTE. So I decided, wow, this is a great opportunity for me to take that job that sounds amazing and also carve out some time on my own, which I had never had before. And what a better way to launch a business, because I have this built-in time into my schedule now. And I actually did take an online course with a couple of different business coaches in the year before I even launched my website. So for me, I don't have a business background, and I really hadn't the faintest clue of how to start a business, though I don't think you really need it. I think an MBA is amazing and inspiring, but I do think because of the internet, everyone does have the ability to kind of go out on their own and do something like this. But I did take a course for about it was a 6-month course before I launched Orchid Story, and I did have the safety net. So those things allowed me to be like, okay, I can try this and see how it goes.
Absolutely. So your day-to-day now, as you know, it's pretty cliche to say that, and I know the typical response is that no day looks exactly the same. But if you could kind of give us an idea of what your day-to-day looks like, specifically in that 50% of what you're doing with Orchid Story, could you kind of share with us what that looks like?
Sure. I'll talk about the summer since, I know it's almost October now, crazy enough. But this summer what I did, what I spent the majority of that time doing was developing a course, and I mentioned that class before. So really I was able to partner with a local business, and that kind of speaks to the importance of networking and just putting yourself out there, and you never know who you're going to meet that can help you along the way. So I happened to meet through just friends in my town, a local woman who was starting up her own business and bringing in people to teach. And I met with her and expressed my interest in teaching a class on personal storytelling. She was interested in having me, so we have a really great relationship going. And so I spent the summer working, really developing that coursework. So, that's like writing and researching and putting together emails and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And from the writing standpoint, I think it's great that we have some built-in activities in what you presented to us. Some of us, I think, writing can come very easily. Others of us, I think, not as easily. So what are some recommendations for those that are looking for a way to put their story out there or get it out from the internal, but maybe the flow of those words on paper don't really come naturally to us?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And for me, writing does come pretty easily, so I tend to forget that it actually is really challenging for some people. So the first suggestion would be try different ways of writing, like try on your computer and try handwriting, literally taking out a pen, getting a notebook. I love that because I carry around a notebook with me, and when I think of something and pops into my head, or someone says something that I think is interesting, or I read something, I write it down, and that will often get your mind going in the writing kind of phase. So that's one suggestion. The other is similar to the exercise that we did today, making a list of your world. Making lists just in general can help us get started. And so there's no pressure. You're not putting any sentences together. You're just making a list. We all make lists. We make to-do lists. So that's another suggestion I have of getting yourself started is try a list.
Yes, that's really helpful. I'm one of those list people. So, once we think about getting to that point, and part of that healing process or processing, what are some other ways that you recommend we could then share that story? Especially if it's an emotional story, a difficult story, as you shared with us about your son, putting it on paper can be a lot easier than verbalizing it, but I believe that can also be a healing process. So what are some ways that we could start sharing that story with others?
So I guess the first thing I would say is that it does not need to be shared. So the literature on this and the science behind it really suggests that the act of actually writing the story, typing the story, putting it together is what generates the healing. So the sharing is really personal, and some people will not want to share their story. That's perfectly okay. So for my course, the goal is to just get your story out of your head and onto the page, not to actually do anything with it. But some people will want to share. So some easy ways, maybe not easy, I shouldn't say, but some ways to consider starting would be to share with a really trusted loved one, either in an email or in a letter form, is a really nice way to get started.
I think that's a really great recommendation for people as they're thinking about pursuing, these tips and strategies that you've shared with us.
And I guess I would just go on to say, like, the more extreme version of sharing your story is to actually tell it in front of an audience. So I did that, I told you, at a national conference.
Right.
But there are a lot of storytelling companies that do local storytelling shows. And so oftentimes they will allow sort of outsiders, people like us in the general public, to participate in their shows. So if you got to a point where you really did want to share the story on a larger platform, that's a fun way to do it, or through a blog would be another way to do it.
Absolutely, and that's actually a good segue too. Speaking of the blog, Rachel did share her story not only here on this webinar, but you can also read through her story in a little bit more detail on our Duke's Take 5 blog. So make sure you check that out in our alumni feature section. Just a few other things here, Rachel. Could you just talk a little bit about your time at JMU and how you established a network and maybe how you have continued to have that engagement or relationship with JMU now as an alum?
Sure. Well, I mentioned in my bio the two pieces of JMU that have really stuck with me, and that was being an integrated science and technology ISET major and participating on the gymnastics team. And so I feel like those pieces of my experience at JMU are really integral to who I am today. I still remain in contact with a lot of ISET majors and my teammates, and it's through a lot of those connections that it doesn't have to be a huge networking opportunity, but I think any opportunity for just connecting over email, even on social media, can open doors for you. So one example of this is way back when I was still a student at JMU. I wrote an article in May session for one of my professors, one of my ISAT professors. Well, that was a huge opportunity right there and led me to have the courage to, in my genetic counseling career, write scientific articles. Now I have a whole bunch of publications, and then that led into personal writing and blogging that I'm doing today. So I think those opportunities that we can grasp that maybe at the time don't seem like such a big deal can really open doors for us, and I love that about JMU.
Absolutely, and I love that you referenced the opening doors. I know for any alumni on listening in, that is a common theme that has really stayed strong no matter when you spent your time here at JMU, about opening those doors for one another. We did have a comment from one listener. I just wanted to share. This individual, first of all, thanks you so much, Rachel, for sharing your story. You know, she was thinking about her self-defining moments, and she was reflecting back when she unfortunately lost her job last year. And she mentioned it being a traumatic experience for her, but she's in a much better place now, a healthier work environment, but the experience realigned her values, as you were talking about, Rachel, and her work ethic and interactions with colleagues. She said it's, you know, a fresh climb for her, but she hopes to turn herself around with this as a success story from hitting a low and then coming back better from it.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it does take time. I think that was actually something I felt myself, and you heard that in my story, but it's also been published in the scientific literature that building in a little time before you dive into your story, because you can't really do it when you're in the middle of a trauma, that is kind of advised.
Absolutely. And then just to wrap things up, I wanted to know if you've ever found a resource in a mentor or having any sort of mentorship experience. I know you were talking about the network and how that has been a support for you. Have you had the opportunity to work with a mentor or be a mentor, and share a little bit about that experience?
Sure, I have. I think we all have a lot of mentors throughout the years, and for me, one of the biggest mentors in my career, in my genetic counseling career, was one of my program directors from the University of Pittsburgh, and that's simply because she was in the field. But that relationship we've maintained our relationship over time, so it's been 12 years since I got my master's in genetic counseling, and she was the one that actually found this new opportunity for me to start this part-time position that was a perfect fit. So I think we don't need to talk to our mentors and have meetings set up on a regular basis, though that can be really lovely and helpful as well. But even those check-ins, and you know, even if it's once a year at a conference or if it's an email every so often, can really impact us, and that's something important to me that I hope I mentor students now at the University of Maryland, and that's one of the reasons why I love my position, is that, I mean, I don't know everything there is to know, but I hopefully have a little bit of wisdom that I can impart onto them.
Well, you obviously have the wisdom to share with all of us, and we so appreciate your time and for putting together this presentation on how you've used your story to help others like us be able to share our story on a path to healing and coming out, as our one listener said, coming out stronger on the other end. So again, on behalf of the JMU Alumni Association, I want to thank you, Rachel, for your time and all of our listeners for joining in today on this Madison Network Alumni webinar. As Rachel mentioned, if you want to reach out to her further, you can contact her at orchidstory.com. And also, as I mentioned, please check out her blog on the Dukes Take 5. That's dukestake5.com in the alumni features, and hear more about her story there. When you exit this presentation, you'll receive a survey, so definitely share your feedback with us so we can continue to offer resources like this to navigate your careers and your personal and professional journeys. So with that, again, Rachel, thank you so much for your time, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Go Dukes!